When I was a kid, there was a store unlike any other. A store where your grandma or mom would take you for those champion sweatpants way before it was cool. A store that had a distinct smell. A store that allowed newcomers, those on a fixed budget, or bargain hunters to get quality goods cheap. A store that has humble beginnings and was later ruined by mismanagement. Right here was one of those stores. In recent years, it was a bargain shop, but to me, it will always be a store full of memories. This is a story of a man who used his knowledge in clothing to create one of the most memorable stores of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. This is the story of Mal Koven and Biway. It truly made a difference. Malcolm Koven, known as Mal, was born April 8, 1929, in Boston, Massachusetts, to his parents Ike and Eva Koven. Koven grew up in a middle-class, mostly Jewish area of Boston. One of his father's first jobs was as a puller, which was a person who tried to entice would-be customers into a clothing store. As time went on, his dad would become a peddler, selling needles, thread, and sundries to newly landed immigrants. He also would provide these immigrants with credit, allowing them to purchase goods. Family was also the heart of the Koven family. During a low point in the Depression, his peddling business was suffering and the bank was threatening to take over his home. His brother Louis would step in and buy the house, allowing Ike and his family to survive the Depression. It was this idea of having a close relationship with family that Mal would use all throughout his life. Koven's father would continue to grow the business in the 1930s and did relatively well. Mal would often help his dad, even at a young age, in collecting payments on the weekends. However, one of the biggest things his dad taught him was ethics. During World War II, Ike refused to deal in the black market. He never overcharged for his goods and worked under the motto to tell the honest truth. Work came naturally to Koven. By 16, he had worked at a local hardware store, stationery store, and as a waiter. Koven was also a well-educated man, having gone to Boston Latin School and Boston College, where he earned a degree in business. One of his classmates at Boston College would be Russ Jacobson, who would later become the third partner in the Biway stores. After graduating, Koven would attempt to begin his career in retail by applying at Filene's executive training program, which he was immediately denied. Upon being denied, Mal's cousin, Danny Koven, gave him advice that stuck with him until his death. If you want to work for a company, go there and take any job. You are better off on the inside looking in than on the outside looking in. With those words in mind, Mal went to Filene's and got a job as a stock boy. Within 3 days, he was promoted to a price stabilization job, and within 3 years, went on to being a clerical worker and then an assistant buyer in merchandising. By the mid-1950s, Mal was a merchandising manager at Filene's within the boys department. Mal learned how to move merchandise fast by selling it at a price where the store could still sell it cheap and make a 25% margin. The best example of this was in 1957 when he convinced his superior to sell boys' snowsuits in July for just $7.99. They sold out instantly, and Koven had to offer rain checks to over 1,000 people. He then went to a supplier and told him he was not going to pay more than $5 a suit, which they accepted. It was this way of purchasing and selling that allowed his department to be one of the most successful at Failings. By the late 1950s, though, things began to change for Koven. With a wife and children at home, taking care of his family was becoming a key priority. The first change he made was by leaving Failings. The store was taking a new direction in the way that they sold products. With these changes, Mal was demoted to a lesser buying job. Then luck struck for Koven. He received a phone call from his brother-in-law, Abe Fish, who invited him to Toronto to work on a new retail venture. The next day, he flew to Toronto, and upon his return, told his family they were moving. The wheels were now in motion to start something big. It was 1961. JFK would announce the United States' ambitious plans to land on the moon. That fall, Toronto Maple Leafs fans would actually see a team that would go on to win the Stanley Cup later that season. And Byway was just getting started. The story of Byway actually begins before Mal. In the late 1950s, Mal's brother-in-law, Abe Fish, partnered with 3 pharmacists to open the first Byway store on Islington in the Toronto suburb of Etobicoke. Abe would later sell his share in this store and open a store of his own with a partner called Westport in Port Credit in 1961, and a second store in Waterloo later that year. When Mal entered the picture, Abe tried to get his partner to split future equity 3 ways. However, they refused, and any future store would allow Abe and Mal to split the equity as they saw fit. This was a great move for Mal and Abe, and a horrible one for Abe's partners. The Waterloo store was struggling. Upon arriving to manage and run the store, Mal was in disbelief. It was disorganized, smelly, and employees didn't seem to care. He went to work immediately. He placed ads in the local paper and tried a similar move to when he was working in Boston by placing certain items at amazing prices. It worked. Sort of. People were lined up around the building to come get these deals. But the next day, sales were back to their old dismal self. Koven knew that the store was in trouble and decided to close it to go work at the store in Port Credit instead. Abe and Mal would operate the Port Credit store, sharing responsibility and creating a good reputation among those in the area. But they still didn't have one thing: the Byway name. That would change in the mid-1960s when they found out the original store on Islington, owned by pharmacist Herbie Title, was up for sale. You may even remember his store called Herbie's from the 1980s. After finding out that the store was about to be sold, Koven called Herb and asked if it had already been sold yet. To his astonishment, it hadn't. Koven and Abe bought that store, and with it, the Byway name was back in their hands. Koven went right to work. He used his skills from Failings to get merchandise from their suppliers at a cost or slightly above cost, and priced it at a point that would sell quickly. Mal's rule was a 25% markup on all goods, something unheard of in the retail industry at that time. His strategy worked. The Islington store went to $1 million in sales within 18 months. This allowed Abe and Mal to work together on opening its first expansion store in Scarborough. However, in 1968, things changed again, this time for the better. Koven was talking to one of his old classmates and associates at Failings, Russ Jacobson. Jacobson, who had recently been offered a job as a national sales manager for London Fog, knew that that job would only last a few years. He stated that he was thinking of going into retail instead. Mel stopped him right there and invited him to Toronto to see his Byway stores, knowing that Russ's experiences would be a tremendous asset to Byway. Russ would join as an equal partner in every store from then on. Koven stated that without him coming on board, Byway would never have had the success of reaching 249 stores. By decade's end, Jacobson's expertise had allowed the chain to expand into Brampton and Aurora, Ontario. But it would be the 1970s where the Byway chain would begin to rise to fame.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
You know what can make the difference between this and this? This.
Some of you mall shoppers are led to believe you're paying the lowest price at those big so-called discount stores popping up everywhere. Who's kidding who? You want low prices, you shop Herbie's.
Coca-Cola, 355 ml cans, case of 24, Coke, Diet Coke, Coke Classic, caffeine-free Diet Coke, Sprite, or Diet Sprite, $7.99. 750 ml bottle, 49 cents, or 2-liter bottle, $1.99.
Shop Herbie's and save big every day.
You know what can make the difference between this and this? This.
In today's world, markup tends to be a dirty word, especially with the consistent rise of inflation. However, when it came to Byway, a minimal markup was used to keep costs low, yet still make profit for the store. From his days at Filings, Koven knew this strategy well. In his autobiography, Koven states that Byway used the 25% markup. Here's how it worked. For example, if they purchased a shirt for 75 cents, they sold it for $1. Koven knew that as long as he didn't overpay for the product, at a 25% markup, he could still undersell anyone and still make a profit. This way of selling would not only prove successful when it came to profits, but when it came to purchasing power. It led to Byway being loyal to their suppliers and allowed for quality goods to continue to flow into their stores. Koven knew that by keeping loyal, it would also allow for better prices. In many cases, Koven stated that they were able to get better prices than any other department store because they made commitments to suppliers before anyone else did. Another example Koven mentions in his book was selling Levi jeans. In most cases, big corporations like Levi did not want to sell to discount retailers. Koven knew this and went right to the CEO of Levi and offered a massive commitment to buy jeans from them. They accepted, and Byway became the third largest retailer of Levi jeans in Canada. It showed just because they were a discount store didn't mean they got discount goods. Koven also went to companies like Beta and purchased the same shoes they sold at the Bay, Sears, and Eaton's. Those stores would buy them for $7 and sell them for $15. But because of the Byway 25% markup, they were able to buy better quality shoes and still sell them for $12. Customers were getting more for less, and Byway was still making a profit. By doing this, it allowed Byway to purchase and sell other quality name shoes such as Keeds, Buster Brown, and Oshkosh. The only time that Koven broke the 25% markup was when he made a deal for NFL licensed merchandise to sell jackets. Even though they were still able to get the jackets within a 25% markup structure, Koven knew that no one would be able to sell them for less than $30. Instead of selling them for $10, Koven sold them for $15, which was still an incredible bargain. Byway was one of the few stores to successfully use the 25% markup model. It allowed for them to branch off into smaller towns across Ontario and Canada. The only other chain that ever came close to their business model was Bargain Harold's, which eventually was sold to Kmart in 1985. Byway was truly a neighborhood store. Customers on average visited the store every 2 weeks. Koven believed in quality goods at a fair price. Again, his motto was Byway would never sell anything you'd be ashamed to bring home to your family. In the early 1970s, when Byway had just 6 stores, the owners of the Canadian firm Dialex approached the principal owners of Byway with an offer to buy 50% of the chain. However, they were promptly turned down as Abe Fish believed that they could grow the Byway chain faster on their own. By 1978, Byway was at 15 stores and was contemplating taking the chain public. However, the market had turned bad and Byway decided to change course. They ended up selling 50% of their chain to Dialex. Byway continued to flourish, and with profits strong, by 1983, Koven, Fish, and Jacobson had decided to sell the remaining 50% to Dialex under one condition. The condition was they continued to run Byway and make the same salary they received before, plus bonuses when applicable. Under Dialex control, competitor chain Family Fare was absorbed by Byway. Although the Family Fare stores tended to be much bigger in size, by changing them to the Byway format, it allowed the chain to expand much quicker than if they had not. The expansion of Byway would end up taking them all the way to the other end of the country by 1985, when Byway would be approached by the operators of the new West Edmonton Mall to put a store in its new wing. Koven was concerned about the leasing cost, but was able to negotiate a contract he was unable to refuse. When Byway opened that September, they did $100,000 plus on the first day alone. It was a great success. The late 1980s would see Byway grow to its peak of 249 stores. Abe Fish would retire from Byway in 1987. Koven would leave in 1990 and Jacobson in 1991. Upon their exit, all 249 stores were profitable. However, once the three wise men left, things rapidly took a turn for the worst. When 1991 came around, Dialex was in trouble. They had gotten into financial issues and began to consolidate their operations. This led to store closures in all of their chain stores, such as Byway, Fairweather, Tip Top, and Susie Shear. They were also sued by Bloomingdale's for the use of the word Bloomies, claiming that they sent mail order stuff to Canada. Dialex caved to their demands. Koven has been noted as saying that if he was still at Byway when that happened, they would have never lost the name Bloomies. By 1995, Dialex was already in bankruptcy reorganization, and Byway was forced to close more stores. Dialex was bleeding money in all of their companies, and unfortunately, it led to a much different way of operating Byway stores than that of what Koven, Fish, and Jacobson had done. In July of 2000, Dialex was once again looking at bankruptcy, except this time it was for good. By the end of August, all remaining Byway locations would close, and all employees would be terminated. Although Byway would be sold to a now defunct American Dollar Store chain, plans to keep the store never came to light, and Byway faded away into the sunset. Even though Koven retired in 1990, his entrepreneurial spirit never died. He came up with several interesting ideas and recommendations that may surprise you. After leaving Byway, Koven wanted to connect in some way with another retailer. He approached Mark Blooms, the CEO of Mark's Work Wearhouse, with an idea of expanding. He tried to get some investors to back the business, but Blooms was worried he would be indebted to the investors and backed out of the deal. Koven also approached the CEO of Canadian Tire in the mid-1990s and suggested they invest in Mark's Work Wearhouse. Canadian Tire's response was, "Why would we do that?" Funny enough, in the late 1990s, Koven contacted the new VP of Canadian Tire, Wayne Sales, and told him about Mark's Work Wearhouse. When Sales was promoted to CEO a few years later, Koven contacted him again, stating that Canadian Tire should purchase the chain and put Mark's stores within Canadian Tire stores. Within 1 year, Canadian Tire did just that by purchasing Mark's. Koven was given a finder's fee for his recommendation. Another chain in which Koven had his hands in was Winners. Koven was in Florida when he saw the chain TJ Maxx had quite a presence there. He contacted the CEO at the time, Ben Cameretta, and to his surprise, found out that the chain wanted to expand into Canada. Koven suggested that TJ Maxx purchase a Canadian chain called Winners, which at the time had just 7 stores. TJ Maxx did just that, and today the Winners name can be seen in over 270 locations across Canada. Even in his retirement, Koven was still leaving a mark in the retail scene in Canada. Just days before the whole world was locked down in March of 2020, an interesting article appeared on the Blog TO website. It mentions that there was a rogue byway in Etobicoke and that it was set to close its stores soon. When I read this, I was in disbelief. Byway Zone? What the heck was that? When Byway closed in 2000, the store location, along with the name, was taken over by the Chopper family, who ran it until 2020. Although they continued to sell household goods, clothing, and shoes, it was not the same as it was. I knew me and the unnamed friend would have to check it out for ourselves.
It's not the same as it was, as it was, as it was. You know it's not the same as it was, as it was, as it was. You know it's not the same as it was, as it was, as it was. You know it's not the same as it was, as it was, as it was. You know it's not the same as it was, as it was, as it was. You know it's not the same as it was, as it was, as it was. You know it's not the same as it was, as it was, as it was. You know it's not the same as it was, as it was, as it was.
Although Byway has been gone for 23 years this August, people fondly remember it, both in a positive and negative way. Here are a few of those memories. In 2011, rumblings began to emerge that Koven was going to relaunch Byway. These rumors were indeed somewhat true. Koven contacted Dollarama with an idea of launching what would be called the Byway $5 Max store, where nothing would be sold for over $5. Although Dollarama appreciated for being considered for the partnership, they passed on the idea and nothing came of it. However, Koven was a person who never quit. Rumors again began to swirl in 2018 that Byway was going to be making a comeback. In fact, signage was seen on a storefront on Bathurst Street in Toronto that a Byway $10 store was coming. Even though at that point nothing was confirmed, the idea of Byway returning looked promising.
All right. Now, do you remember Byway? Because I actually don't. And it's
Really?
coming, the retail brand is making a comeback.
I'm having a great
remember
time
Byway.
talking about this on 680 today because,
Okay.
yeah, I remember Byway. They were very much a discount retailer.
You know what can make the difference?
We're looking at an old Byway commercial here. They actually had 250 stores across Canada. There's the famous Byway bag. They all closed by 2001, but Byway making a comeback. It's going to open a 15,000 square foot location just south of Yorkdale Mall. And it's going to have a $10 concept where nothing will be more than $10 in this new Byway store.
So it's like a 10-time dollar store.
Yeah, that's kind of what they always were, a lot of discount stuff. But
However, in 2020, Koven was now 90 years old and in declining health. On March 17, 2020, Abe Fish, Koven's business partner and more importantly brother-in-law, passed away. And just 6 months later, on October 6, 2020, the legend himself, Mel Koven, passed away at the age of 91. Plans for the new Byway were put on hold, and 1 year later, in October of 2021, were scrapped entirely. On its official Instagram page, a statement appeared that said that the founder Mel Koven was the brains of the operation, and without him, the store opening was not going to happen. Oddly enough, that post has now been deleted. Having seen this, and knowing Byway was officially dead, I had to make the journey to Toronto to pay my respects. So long, Byway. Canada's retail scene won't be the same without you.